Richard Feynman said, "Never confuse education with intelligence. You can have a PhD and still be an idiot." What are some real-life examples of this? My wife's stepfather was a chemist who currently has diabetes. One night he went to the ER because his blood sugar was dangerously high. He claimed he was eating well, he normally doesn't, so there's no reason why his blood sugar was high. In his car was a 2-liter bottle of ginger ale mixed in with grape juice. He said that the two cancelled their sugars out and we didn't know what we were talking about because he was a chemist and he knows how to combine things. And here I am, having not gone to college for chemistry or any field of science I'm interested in, because I believe I'm not intelligent enough to be any kind of scientist. While I feel like I'm not intelligent, I also kinda wish I was dumber asterisk so I could just blindly go into things that other people do and seem to end up just fine. Lol. I have a PhD and I am an idiot in most respects. All it takes to get a PhD is to be really good at or persistent in doing research in one narrow area of study. Edit. So several commenters pointed out that I simplified things too much. A PhD also requires hard work, luck, and some basic competence in a topic. But that doesn't preclude one from being completely clueless in other aspects of life. The best quote I've heard about this is, "They don't give PhDs to the smartest people, they give them to the most stubborn." I once spilled some food on the floor as I was plating it up. So I very carefully used a paper towel to wipe up that droplet of sauce. Then yeeted my entire dinner and plate into the bin. I spent a good 5 seconds staring at the paper in my hand, wondering how I was going to eat it, at which point husbando appeared and said, "You have a PhD." Peter Duesberg, molecular biologist who works as a researcher at UC Berkeley and has an otherwise stellar career and well known for his work, became an AIDS denialist, claiming there's no link between HIV and AIDS. Led countless people down the rabbit hole, including many who were HIV positive. These individuals ended up infecting others and refusing antiretroviral therapies. This included an AIDS denialist activist named Christine Maggiore who infected her infant through breastfeeding, thinking, "Hey, it's not a big deal, it's just HIV, it doesn't cause AIDS." I worked with a girl that graduated from Brown. Oh, she would never shut up about it. Always Brown this and Brown that. I went to a state school and it was apparent that she looked down on anyone that didn't attend an Ivy League school. So one day she was doing that and I couldn't stop myself. I said something like, "Oh, you went to Brown." And yet, here we are, together in the same place, doing the same job. I had someone on my ship who wouldn't shut up about being older and college educated. She was 3 ranks below me. She had no grasp on the concept of experience. I have a PhD, and I work with a bunch of PhDs. Basically, a lot of them think that because they succeeded in one area, they are an expert in every other area of life. And they always have strong opinions about everything. I think it's also called a PhD syndrome. I think my imposter syndrome cannibalized my PhD syndrome. One of the main benefits from my education was to teach me how much I don't know. It's baffling to me that people get confidence to speak on things they don't know anything about just because they're educated. I had a professor for higher mathematics who had real difficulties figuring out how to extract a cup of coffee from the vending machine. Bless him. I had a student job doing IT for the classroom equipment at my college. My job wouldn't have existed if having a PhD meant you could figure out technology. I work with lawyers and I'm convinced they trade every other brain cell they have for their law degree. Sounds like a relative of mine. A PhD in veterinary medicine by 30, has worked on genetic research in dogs and developed a new technique on measuring canine metabolism. Same person spent 2 whole lessons of driving school trying to figure out how the steering wheel asterisk works. Edit. To be clear, I don't think she's an idiot, the comment just reminded me of her. Sometimes I think she just processes things differently from most people. Not quite PhD. But I was at a party, in the UK, full of med students and stereotypically everyone was off their face drunk. Well, some guy fell over and broke his collarbone and immediately got rushed by a dozen of them all fussing and asking him the same questions over and going through the checklist. Half an hour later and he's still on the couch in pain and I go in to ask if anybody knows why the ambulance is taking so long. Nobody had an answer because nobody had called one. A party full of medical students hadn't called an ambulance or made any transport arrangements for a guy in severe pain with a broken clavicle. Idiots. That's actually super common in emergencies when there's a group of any kind. One of the first things you learn in a lifeguard certification course is to identify a single person to instruct to call 911. Never just yell out, "Someone call 911," or assume that it's been done because everyone in the group is assuming someone else did it already. It's not necessarily that everyone forgot about it, just that everyone assumed it was the logical first step that someone else would have taken already. Sounds like one of those situations where students or newbies in a field try to apply their newfound skills to any possible situation. I've seen it with CS students, with pole science students, and others. It's reminiscent of an oft-reposted joke about a physicist, an engineer and a programmer trying to fix a car. There's also a saying that when your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. I worked IT for a hospital. I was speaking to a doctor who forgot his password. While he was spelling his name phonetically over the phone, he said, Z as in xylophone. Needless to say, my eyebrows raised. I work in software development for a major chain of hospitals. One that the executives, MD, asked me to make a substantial UI change to a product owned by McKesson. Just change the colors, it's simple. My teenager could do it. Me, I can make the request of the vendor. That's ridiculous. You just need to go in there and change it. Out of spite, I made the request with the vendor, and they came back with a quote that was more than 2 liver transplants. The executive told my CTO I was being difficult and couldn't perform simple tasks. He literally did not understand that vendor software was different than a Wix website. Dr. Ben Carson, one of the most skilled neurosurgeons alive, thinking that the Egyptian pyramids were used to store grain. This guy operated on the brain of a fetus while it was still in the womb. He was the first in human history to ever do that. I wonder if he got killed and replaced by a clone sometimes. Yep. I had to read his life story in school way before he got into politics, and he is genuinely really good at his job and his life story is interesting. I didn't realize how little he knew about other topics until he ran for president. As someone who works security in a hospital, I can say a good 90% of the doctors there are smart but lack any type of common sense, and sometimes I wonder how they function on a day-to-day basis. Edit. I also forgot to mention I'm almost 2 years in a relationship with a pediatric cardiologist, and it's as shocking at home as it is with the ones I work with LMAO, but I can't say it's boring. I was at a keg party at college and the gravity keg was set up. Someone complained that the beer was not flowing, so I checked that the keg was still almost full. Turns out someone closed the air intake on top. I opened the intake and poured myself a beer. Problem solved. A few minutes later, someone else complains the beer is out. I told them the keg was full a few minutes ago and it was a tap problem that I fixed. They told me they just came from the keg. I go back to the keg and find the intake was closed again. Opened it and poured the young lady who said it was empty a beer. As she is leaving, my sweet mate comes in and goes to the intake and closes it. Now my sweet mate is a straight A student who gets A's mostly due to his photographic memory. Back to the keg. So I tell him that he needs to leave the intake open to let air in to displace the beer coming out of the lower tap. He then proceeds to tell me that since the beer is carbonated, air is not needed to replace the liquid volume lost when the beer is dispensed. So I asked him 2 questions. If it is not needed, why is there the upper tap? And does he really think the amount of gas the carbonation gives off in a glass of beer is equal to the volume of the liquid beer? He thought for a few seconds and his only response was, "I have a 4.0, what is your GPA?" Then he walked away. I seriously freaking hope that was not a real response. I hope your response was, "Awesome. Your GPA matches your IQ." I know many people in the science field that conduct double-blind randomized controlled experiments in the lab and then go home and check their horoscopes. I had a boss who was an engineer who put a couple $100 in change in a bank's pneumatic drive-through tube where it got stuck and they had to use a jackhammer to get it out. He was upset that the bank was charging him for this because he didn't know this would happen. They had large signs saying not to put change in the tubes, including on the tubes themselves. My first call at my first IT job was in a medical laboratory. There was a doctor who had been in the job for years and she called saying her computer would not power on. I walked her through some troubleshooting and nothing worked. Is the computer plugged in? Okay. Is the monitor on? Okay. When did the problem start? Type of questions were asked and she answered them all. I go up to her office and indeed the computer is plugged into a power strip which is plugged into itself. Cleaning crew had deep cleaned her office and never plugged anything back in. Doctor plugged the power strip into itself thinking that as long as it was plugged in, that's all she needed. Part of me wonders if she got the cords mixed up, like she thought what she was plugging in was something other than the power strip. Depending on the length of the cords, I could see it getting lost in the tangle and just plugging it in. I worked for a statistician who had a PhD in statistics and was dumb as a post. OTOH, I worked with this really smart guy who happened to have a PhD, and as he said it, all that means is I did the work, for a PhD. I worked with a climate scientist who could analyze climate data like nobody's business, but if you wanted him to do literally anything else you had to hold his hand the entire time. Zero common sense. 2. The senior staff at that office idolized him because of the PhD after his name, but one time he was in a car accident in a work vehicle, also his fault, and I asked for a copy of the police report for insurance purposes, and he said he didn't get one because, I thought you handled that. Why would I, who was not present at the time of the accident, have the police report that was written at the time of the accident? The other guy that you ran into has one. I went to 3 years when I felt something was wrong with my arm. It felt like a bug bite day 1 and by day 4 a bungee cord from my elbow to my wrist. 3 doctors said it was a skin irritation or dermatitis. I kept telling them something was wrong. I have no medical degree. I work in property management. Day 5 I walked into another and said, I don't care if I have to pay out of pocket or sit here all night, but something is wrong with my arm. Finally, after many rude looks and comments, I was given an ultrasound of my arm. Then rushed to a MRI. Then told I was being admitted. A 3 inches blood clot in my upper arm, 2 in my chest area, and 1 had passed my lung already. Diagnosed with factor 2 gene mutation 22 days later, blood clotting disorder. Damn. Good for you being persistent. That is pretty wild that they missed that. I'm glad you did finally get a proper diagnosis. Did you call back to the other places to tell them what asses they were? I found a lump, and when I went to the doctor, they originally concluded that it was just being small, or whatever. I knew better. Luckily, they ordered an ultrasound as a precaution, and it turned out to be stage 1 cancer. My parents' neighbor complained of a bad headache, so they went to the They told him he did have just a bad headache and sent him on his way. The stroke he was having left him paralyzed for the rest of his life. He lived for 3 more years and it took 2 more after that for them to settle the lawsuit against the My ex-boyfriend's mother was a linguistics professor and knew over 10 languages. She was also one of the dumbest people I've ever met. Some examples. She believed that in case of emergency stewardesses catapult out of the plane. She was also convinced donating blood causes some blood disease and you can die because of it. But my favorite one was when she said her son's orthopedic problems are not a result of a serious injury he had. His knee hurts because he eats too much ketchup. Man, that ketchup is going straight to my knees. I'ma need to sit for a minute. A doctor telling me my 6-month-old couldn't have strep because she was infant and taking her to the because she was getting worse and no urgent cares were open and finding out she had strep. Got one better. Psych nurse here. Got a fax on a patient at a local for possible psychiatric admission. Frequent flyer of hours on my unit. Her blood pressure was through the roof. She had facial drooping on one side, body paralysis on one side, and slurred speech. Anyone with a hint of healthcare knowledge will tell you that those are classic signs of an active stroke. So I called the thinking maybe they meant to send the fax to our medical unit and sent it to us by mistake. Nope. I said, you do know she's having a stroke with those symptoms, right? A nurse proceeds to tell me that the doc thinks she is faking those symptoms because she has a significant psychiatric history. I said, so you think she's faking a blood pressure of 280/165 and body paralysis? She hung up on me. Our psychiatrist calls the back on speaker to find out what's going on. Doctor tells her patient is faking these symptoms because, and I quote, schizophrenics cannot have strokes. Our psychiatrist asked him here he went to med school because they owed him a refund. Tears of joy. This is basically what The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam is about. It tells the story of how the Kennedy and Johnson administrations got the United States into the Vietnam War, and it particularly zeroed in on Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He kept escalating the conflict at every turn, and if you questioned him he could bury you in data showing that the US was winning the war and the Defense Department just needed more troops and more money to put us over the top. I'm grossly oversimplifying a great book, but that's the gist of it. A great companion piece to the book is a documentary called The Fog of War by Errol Morris. It's a one-on-one interview with Robert McNamara filmed near the end of his life where he ruminates on the lessons he's learned. After watching it, 90% of people come away from the experience thinking that McNamara is a particularly intelligent and sagacious man, even though there's a mountain of evidence showing that that's not the case. My professor, a brilliant neurosurgeon, once decided to directly smell a bottle of ammonia. He then told me, "Don't smell that." I did not plan to. Relevant XKCD. https://xkcd.com/242. My college roommate, smartest person I've ever met, spent nearly an hour trying to shove a desk back into the corner of our room at an angle. She wouldn't listen to me because, in her words, she got this. After she finally gave up, I walked over, pulled the desk out completely and straightened it with the wall, and pushed it back in. One movement, no struggle. Many a time we had where I'd realize she might be the smart one, but I've got more common sense. My uncle is smart as fuck. Multiple master's degrees in education and science, constantly wins awards for his teaching and high averages from his students. Tell me why this idiot needed me to remind him how to make ramen several times over. Worked at a tech company, was made team-led. One of our team members was a PhD in astrophysics. He would ping me constantly for how to do things that we had well documented. How to install certain programs, how to gain access to servers or code repositories. Literally, we would sit in Zoom calls together and I would just read the instructions out loud and watch him do them. I was utterly confused as to how he could breathe by himself. As someone who did 2 trades and then decided life is better with education, my experience currently going to uni is how clueless so many people are in uni. I wouldn't say they're an idiot, but tons of ignorance develops living in a student bubble your whole life. I rented a room to a guy who did his masters and it would take him hours SSS to cook dinner. I watched him one day and he just couldn't wrap his mind around cooking things that take different amounts of time to cook. Like, he'd start cooking potatoes and wait till they were done before moving on to the next thing he was going to eat them with. A long-time good friend, absolutely brilliant. Can literally beat you at chess blindfolded. Engineering in college and one of the smartest people I've ever met. But he's a big picture guy, sees how things develop and great long-term vision. Incredibly successful. But little things? Guy couldn't pack a suitcase, wouldn't know how to book a flight. Was making boxed mac and cheese and couldn't figure out why it was so watery. Yeah, he didn't drain the water after the pasta was cooked. If you work IT, you feel this. Every lawyer, doctor, celebrity and CEO I've ever worked with is computer illiterate. They can email, they can Twitter, and that's it. They confuse the mouse, they openly call themselves Luddites, they kick the power plug out and claim the box broke. Mega millionaires, too. Smart in other regards, but computers are kryptonite. I used to work at a university, and tons of academics are incredibly educated in their chosen field, but have the common sense of your average dachshund. My favorite was probably an entire group of geology professors and PhD candidates who got stuck for a good few minutes in an entryway because they didn't think to check if the door required a pull rather than a push. Bearing in mind that they'd just entered with that same door not an hour before. My wife has 2 masters and a PhD, is internationally recognized in her field, and is an absent-minded doofus. My role in her life is to ensure that her car works, that she takes her meds, and that she eats things other than yogurt and eggs. She can be brilliant one minute, then walk into the side of a moving bus the next. I love her dearly, but she's a numpty.